I like to begin with a quote from Isaac Newton. I've been carrying this around ever since I was in high school. I was like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. And the reason why I do that is because this subject that we're going to get into is a vast subject. It's an important subject, and it's also a controversial subject. There's a lot of different positions on it. Some of you have read the paper that I wrote, Original Sin and Ancestral Sin. It's at that link, and I will share this as a handout. It's a PDF file that you're looking at right now, but I will share this with you. So if anyone wants a copy of these slides, you can get that as well. This presentation will include questions about the first sin and the nature of humanity after the fall, and look at some differing viewpoints within Christianity about this, comparing those viewpoints, and consider some ancient wisdom for practical application today. As Mariah said, I have two doctorates that are relative to this. One is in biblical studies, but the other one is in ministry. So the question is, all right, now that we know what the scriptures say, then how do we apply that to minister to people, to help people? That's an important aspect. On the basic side, let's begin with some definitions. The basic definition, which would apply to most Christians that believe in some form of original sin or ancestral sin, is that it's a predisposition towards sin, which is part of all humanity, believed to stem from humanity's fall. This belief does not take away from individual responsibility, but it does highlight the inbuilt factors within environment and heredity which push us towards disobedience, and it corresponds to observable facts about human nature. We can simply express this by saying, since humanity's fall, everyone inherits an inclination to sin and a desire to go his or her own way rather than obey God. Human beings are sinful by nature. And that comes out of Erdman's handbook. When we move forward on, we need to consider the fact that God created man and women in his image, in the nature of human beings, which reflects the nature of God. All the goodness in humanity comes from this aspect of our creation, but the image of God has been spoilt in us by the fall. So we need to look at the fall. What is the fall? The fall is humanity's choice to be independent of God and his will, a choice in which we are all involved, and which has resulted in the deflection of humanity from the path God intended, the distortion of the image of God in mankind, and the spoiling of the creation itself. However, there is a significant difference between the Roman Catholic or Western perspective and the Orthodox or Eastern perspective on original sin, often referred to more accurately as ancestral sin by the Orthodox Church. So what is ancestral sin? That's the fact that every person born comes into the world stained with the consequences of the sins of Adam and Eve and of their other ancestors. So these consequences are chiefly mortality, a tendency to sin, and an alienation from God and other people. Now, here's the difference. Original sin, in the Orthodox view, does not carry guilt, for a person is guilty only of his or her own sins, and not those of Adam and Eve. Therefore, the Orthodox Church does not believe that a baby who dies unbaptized is condemned to hell. And that comes right out of the Orthodox Study Bible. Enter Augustine, 4th century. Generally affirms that humanity inherited both the tendency to sin and the guilt of Adam and Eve's sin. The doctrine in Eastern Christianity is that humanity inherited the tendency, but not the guilt. This doctrine is also adopted by some in the Western Church and is called Arminianism and sometimes semi-Pelagianism. So let's see what Pelagianism is. It's a belief that was held by a minority of Christians that neither the condition nor the guilt of original sin is inherited. Rather, we all freely face the same choice between sin and salvation that Adam and Eve did. This was opposed by the Council of Carthage in 418 AD. And there are other views which I discussed in the paper, but we won't have time to get into all of them in this presentation. So if we're created in God's image, we have to take in consideration that God created humankind to reflect his character. But in some way, sin has affected that image. So we have some people, and it's very popular today. If you're familiar with Matthew Fox or Father Richard Rohr, they emphasize original blessing rather than original sin. So there's also that view out there. There's also the fact that this whole subject compares compassion from God with wrath from God. So it's suggested by those in the Orthodox Church that the doctrine of ancestral sin naturally leads to a focus on human death and divine compassion as the inheritance from Adam, while the doctrine of original sin shifts the center of attention to human guilt and divine wrath. And Anthony Hughes, especially those of you that are interested in counseling, he has an excellent paper on this, which is at that link on this page. Ancestral sin in Greek, hamartema, refers to an individual act of sin. The Eastern Church Fathers assigned full responsibility for the sin in the garden to Adam and Eve alone. The more commonly known word, hamartia, is a more familiar term, which literally means missing the mark, and is used to refer to the condition common to all humanity. The Eastern Church never speaks of guilt being passed from Adam and Eve to their progeny, as Augustine and the Western Church did. Instead, each person bears their own guilt in the eyes of the Eastern Church. So what then is the inheritance of humanity from Adam and Eve, if not guilt? This is where Romanities enters in. And he writes, man is born with the parasitic power of death within him. So the Eastern Church looks at the ancestral sin as a disease, something that is caught, but it's not passing on the guilt. If someone sneezes and someone else contracts a disease from that, that doesn't mean they're guilty. It just means that they need some type of healing therapy. So the disease passes on, but not guilt. Cyril of Alexandria also teaches that our human nature became diseased through the sin of one. Therefore, for the Orthodox Fathers, it's not guilt that is passed on, but it's a condition, a disease that results in death. So healing has remedies and cures, but guilt is inherent to the individual. Major difference. The fall in Orthodox theology is that sin is generated through the corruption of humanity because of death. In the post-Orthodox, post-Christian West, however, many people see death as both the natural created state of man and an unacceptable reality. This mental bind is also not Orthodox. So this view would be like a person would say, well, what about the animals? They live, they're born and they live and they die. And what about vegetation? You know, right now in the fall, we're seeing the leaves fall and things go from green to brown. What did they do to sin? So those kind of questions come up, and then theologians wrestle with the answers. Death, being the curse of Eden, is an unnatural enemy, theologically, neither designed into creation by God nor desired by God. So the threat of death, in the Orthodox view, leads to materialism and hedonism. Death, as the ultimate threat, causes people to flee from their fellow humanity and their God in a selfish pursuit of material things, as if these things will enhance or extend life. Hedonism is the real death, the death of the spirit, from which death itself has cast a longer and longer shadow over the godless secularism of Western materialism. All right, now we're entering into a realm that I'm more familiar with than theology. We'll look at Paul's writings in Romans. Paul wrote that just as sin entered the world through Adam, death also entered. This is usually referred to as the fall, which we've discussed. Most Christians believe that Jesus' death and resurrection provide salvation not only from personal sin, but from the condition of sin itself. This is an important aspect in the concept of ancestral sin or original sin. So Romans 5:12 in Greek, translated by the King James this way: wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Okay, now that can be translated or interpreted further into different ways. So Latin in the Vulgate, and this is the old Douay-Rheims translation of the Vulgate: wherefore, as by one man sin entered into this world, and by sin death, and so death passed upon all men, in whom all have sinned. Now, this "in whom all have sinned" is what creates the question. So what I'm going to do is go into the Syriac for a second. Very much neglected part of biblical studies. As by means of one man, sin entered into the world, and by means of sin, death. And so death passed upon all the sons of men, inasmuch as they all have sinned. This is a little clearer. Here we're looking at each individual sinning. And the Antioch Bible translation of the Syriac, which comes out of the Gorgias Press in New Jersey, by the way: for just as sin entered into the world through a single man, and death through sin, so death has come upon everyone, since everyone has sinned. So here, to compare this, we have "for all have sinned" in the King James, "because all have sinned" in the English Standard Version, and then we have "inasmuch as they all have sinned" in the Peshitta Aramaic. In the Greek, in the Latin, in the old Douay-Rheims, we have "in whom all have sinned," but they changed that recently. So the New American Catholic Bible says "inasmuch as all sinned." So that's leaning more toward an ancestral sin concept. In Latin, this Greek idiom, "epho," which means "because of," was translated as "in whom." So a lot of this goes back to the Vulgate. Saying that all have sinned in Adam is quite different than saying that all sinned because of him. Now, Romanities, another controversial individual. The importance of a correct definition of original sin and its consequences can never be exaggerated. A proper approach must consider the problem in Romans 5:12, the phrase "epho pantes hematon," by trying to make it fit any certain system of thought concerning moral law and guilt, without first establishing the importance of Paul's beliefs concerning the powers of Satan and the true situation not only of man, but of all creation. It's also inaccurate to deal with the problem of transmission of original sin within the framework of dualistic anthropology, while at the same time completely ignoring the Hebraic foundations of Paul's anthropology. Likewise, any attempt to interpret the biblical doctrine of the fall in terms of a hedonistic philosophy of happiness is already doomed to failure because of its refusal to recognize not only the abnormality, but more important, the consequences of death and corruption. So to those who would say that death is a natural process, the biblical scholar would say, but Paul said it is the last enemy that is destroyed. So we have that controversy there. So according to Romanities, a correct approach to the Pauline doctrine of original sin must take into consideration the fallen state of creation, including the powers of Satan, death, and corruption. Secondly, the justice of God and law, and anthropology and the destiny of man in creation. And when we talk about justice, we're going to see that the Roman Catholic view looks at justice differently than what you would normally think of in terms of justice. And we'll see that in a little bit further in the presentation. There are heavy objections to Romanities by Vlad Moss, and those are published on the internet, 98 pages of objections. He comes on very strongly against Romanities. So let's also look at the origin of original sin. As widespread as the term is, it was unknown in either the Eastern or Western churches until Augustine in the latter part of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century. The concept may have arisen in the writings of Tertullian, but the expression seems to have first appeared in Augustine's writings. Prior to Augustine, theologians used the terminology used by the Greek fathers, ancestral sin. And then ancestral sin and original sin is then also directly related to the atonement. So the concept of a sacrificial offering for atonement is linked in that if there's vicarious transmission of guilt and sin and death, then we need a vicarious savior as well. Some other relevant beliefs. Some people challenge the entire doctrine of original sin as unbiblical, understanding that the concept is to contradict Mosaic teaching, that the children should not be punished for the sins of the fathers. Also, Ezekiel 18:20 says unequivocally that descendants are not to be punished for their parents. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. Other related texts, Deuteronomy 5:9 restricts any type of iniquity of the fathers being held toward the children unto 3 or 4 generations, and that's it. And then Deuteronomy 24:16 says the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. So, how did Jews visit this issue? And one of the things I didn't mention to Mariah is that I also studied with the yeshiva, getting 90 credits from them because I wanted to get Jewish viewpoints directly from Orthodox teachers. Judaism rejects the concept of original sin altogether and stresses free will and men's responsibility of their actions rather than religious obedience or faith. why they ask, would God, who is universal, unconditional love, create human beings, then intentionally let them become corrupt, putting the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden, telling them not to eat? Just like if I took one of my children when they were younger and I painted a room and said, there's wet paint in there, don't touch it. It's the first thing they'd want to do. Punish them from generation to generation with eternal torture for simply just being born in the world and for nothing else. Or judge people not on their own actions, but their faith or lack of it. Then by whim, save the beings from nothing else but from his own wrath. Now again, these are not necessarily my views, but they're the views of the people that I'm referring to here. So what is Judaism's view on this? In their prayer book, the Seder, they have a prayer, which is Elohai Neshama Shenatata Bi Tahorahi. Oh my God, the soul that you have put within me, it is pure. That's the Jewish view. Judaism teaches that humans are born morally pure, and this seems to be founded on a basic understanding of the creation story within Holy Scripture. Humans created in the image of God with freedom of choice to obey or disobey God. Therefore, instead of a concept analogous to original sin, they affirm that people are born with either, actually both, a Yetzer HaTov, a tendency to do good, and a Yetzer Hara, a tendency to do evil. And that's illustrated by this little guy up here in the corner. You probably have seen illustrations like this, where you have the little devil on the one side tempting and the little angel on the other side tempting, and we got to figure out which one to obey. That's the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. Thus, human beings have free will to choose the path in life that they will take. The rabbis even recognize a positive value to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, in that without it, there would be no civilization or other fruits of human labor. There'd be no ambition. There'd be no competition in the world. The implication is that Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara are best understood not as moral categories of good and evil, but as the inherent conflict within man between selfless and selfish orientations. What is the classical biblical view? Adam and Eve's sin is recounted in the book of Genesis, sometimes called the original sin. The term used in classical Jewish literature is Adam Hatah, the sin of the first man, or of Adam. After eating the fruit, Adam became aware of his nakedness. God bestowed a curse upon each of the active participants. First, the earth is cursed with thorns. Next, the serpent's physical form is altered, and God sets up eternal enmity between Eve and the serpent and all their offspring. God then pronounces two curses upon Eve. First, she's to suffer the difficulties of pregnancy. Second, her husband will henceforth rule over her, and she will strive for that power. God then tells Adam that he will now struggle for his sustenance and places the fault of fallen mankind on his shoulders. So we must ask, what is the effect of original sin? Is it an ancestral predisposition, or is actual guilt also passed on? Now, Protestantism interprets this we'll look at Luther and Calvin, this inherently sinful nature, the basis for the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity, results in complete alienation from God and total inability of humans to achieve reconciliation with God based on their own abilities. Not only do individuals inherit a sinful nature due to Adam's fall, but since he was the head and representative of the human race, all whom he represents inherit the guilt of his sin by imputation. The relevant beliefs include, since every human being is flawed, the ritual washing away of the unchosen but inevitable condition of birth sin, the remedy is baptism. Then the Council of Trent in the 16th century, although it did not make this solution obligatory by a definition, the solution of baptism for original sin. Otherwise, the baby's going to be damned to hell. It didn't make this solution obligatory. It regarded it with favor and authorized its use. Original sin is described not only as the death of the soul, but as the privation of justice that each child contracts at its conception. Now, here's where we get into a specific definition of justice. What they're calling justice is defined as sanctifying grace, that God has taken that away because of original sin. And each child should have had personally his own justice. So now after the fall, he suffers his own privation of justice. Now let's look at Anselm. We could add an argument based on the principle of Augustine, already cited. The deliberate sin of the first man is the cause of original sin. This principle is developed further by Anselm, in that the sin of Adam was one thing, but the sin of the children at their birth is quite another. The former was the cause, and the latter is the effect. In a child, original sin is distinct from the fault of Adam. It is one of its effects. But which of these effects is it? The Roman Catholic view includes death and suffering as the physical results, concupiscence or lust, rebellion against God as a spiritual effect, and the absence of sanctifying grace in newborn children. Now, of course, when we're dealing with theology, we're going to have the arguments going back and forth. So now, objections to this. Augustine's teachings have fundamental importance in Western theology, but the East never accepted his grace theology or anthropology, which led to doctrines such as the Immaculate Conception, and I respectfully refer to it sometimes as the Immaculate Exception, because Mary was born without this original sin, according to Catholic doctrine. Then we have the doctrine of limbo, which at one point was in, but now isn't in Catholic doctrine. And then we have merit and indulgences, where you can get time off for indulgences, which was a major problem that Luther had with Tetzel and started a big part of the Reformation. And this resulted in even fundamental doctrines such as soteriology being understood differently. Then we have John Cassian and John Chrysostom, who both took exception to it, and medieval Catholic theologians who classified both Cassian and Chrysostom as drifting into semi-Pelagianism. All right, to simplify, I grabbed this chart off the internet. Before the fall, our intellect has infused knowledge. We get it directly from God. Our will is loving obedience. We have integrity. Our passion, spontaneous virtue. Our body, no suffering or death. Everything is good. Then the fall. Now we have ignorance. We have to acquire knowledge. We're inclined to sin. We become weak and disordered in our passions. We have suffering and death in our body. So what's the antidote? From the Catholic viewpoint, faith, which binds us to God and his truth, and spiritual warfare, spiritual combat in the form of charity and doing good works, and hope in the resurrection. How about from orthodoxy? The basic Orthodox beliefs, and I put these in this pattern here because it starts with the human person is the spiritual center of the universe. Then it's possible to conceive that God may have created the universe for us, a gift to us, and this should instill an awesome sense of wonder. in us and thankfulness toward God. So then, because the human person in Scripture is the pinnacle of creation, made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, that's what we're striving for. So that's our sanctification process. And then in God's image in us is distorted, but it's not depraved as far as Calvinism would go. We're not guilty of sins that we haven't committed ourselves, as far as Roman Catholicism would go. All right, so what about the critics of the Orthodox view? They remind us that according to Psalm 50 or 51, depending upon what set of Psalms you're using, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. In the Masoretic text, this is capable of being interpreted either in the Western manner or in the Eastern Orthodox manner. And let's look at it from a translation from the Aramaic Peshitta. For behold, I was formed in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. I must point out here that the way original sin was considered transmitted was through sexual intercourse between the father and the mother. So that developed into an interpretation of this verse from the Psalm. But let's look at the Septuagint. This says, behold, I was brought forth in iniquities, plural, and in sins, plural, did my mother conceive me. This clarifies the Orthodox position that sin is endemic to the human condition from birth to death. It says nothing about transmission, let alone transmission by sex. Now we have Theodore of Mopsuestia in the 4th and 5th century. Because of the fall, Adam caused his posterity to inherit a nature which was subject to temptation and inclined towards sin, though this nature had not originally been sinful, nor had sinfulness as such ever come to be an inherent element of it. Theodore continues to insist that it is by man's choices that he becomes sinful, rather than through his nature. His position is that since the inherited connection between Adam and his posterity is obviously the human nature rather than the will, then sin, not being constituent property of this nature, cannot itself be passed on or inherited. For Theodore, sin is disobedience to the divine law and can only be exercised by free and unconstrained will. Included among the propositions clearly and fervently advanced in Theodore's writings, therefore, are these: that there is a distinction between nature and will, that sin cannot be inherited, that it is the property of the will and not of the nature. These anthropological considerations provide the context within which the sacramental theology of the Church of the East takes shape. Calomiris, an Eastern scholar, recognizing the true balance position, the Church Fathers emphasize synergy, the mystery of God's grace being given with the cooperation of the human heart. This is also apparent in some forms of Judaism, where God and man work together in partnership. The Roman idea of justice found prominence in Augustinian and later theology. The idea that Adam and Eve offended God's infinite justice and honor made death God's method of retribution. But this idea of justice deviates from biblical thought. Calomiris explains that the meaning of justice in the Greek of the New Testament is rooted in an earlier Hebrew concept. He says that the Greek word diakousene, justice, is a translation of the Hebrew word tzedakah. The word means divine energy, which accomplishes man's salvation. It is parallel, almost synonymous with the word hesed, which means mercy and compassion, love, and the word emet, which means fidelity and truth. This is entirely different from judicial understanding of justice from the Roman Catholic viewpoint. So, in belief, as we wrap up, in the Orthodox view, we inherited the consequences of Adam's sin, which is fallen sinful nature and mortality, ancestral sin. In the Catholic view, we inherit the guilt of Adam's sin because we were in the loins of Adam when he sinned. All of his progeny has to share in the guilt. So now, another quote, this time from F. Scott Fitzgerald. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So with all these thoughts in mind, in a moment we'll have some Q&A here. One might raise the question about all this, so what? But we've already seen that these doctrines are very important in terms of theological, dogmatic theology. There's variances of opinions in various church groups. There's liturgical applications. There's the judicial on the one side and the therapeutic on the other side, comparing the Western and the Eastern viewpoints. Salvation or damnation is involved in this. And then healing is involved in this. And then because of that, we have counseling applications for those of you that are involved in ministering to others. So when we look at this, we have a dichotomy here of comparing life and death, blessing and fear, innocence and damnation or the fall, sin, guilt, propensity versus guilt, and the will, the atonement or reconciliation. How does that occur? Is it judicial or therapeutic in the way we minister to people to help them with the gospel?